Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Matthew already spoke on the 6 days of creation very briefly, and I've been asked then to go back and do more detail in Genesis 1 and 2. And even though it only covers 8 verses, there's a tremendous amount of depth there, a lot of understanding and meaning, and a lot of things we can take away here. And I'm only going to scratch the surface, believe it or not. There's a lot more that can be said about what we find there. The detail we find in the Genesis account is truly remarkable. We're still trying to figure a lot of it out. We don't have final answers. And in fact, I'm going to challenge you with some interesting ideas today, which will challenge some concepts we've had before. And just keep in mind that we don't have final answers in everything. The Word of God is the final answer. Unfortunately, we don't understand it completely. And that's what our goal should be, to try to understand it completely and work on that. So let's just start off with the text there. The very first verse in the Bible is, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." And already there's a lot of stuff there. The first few 3 words, "in the beginning." That's the beginning of everything. And Matthew already talked about the beginning of space and matter and energy and time. And by the way, modern ideas of physics, I've studied quite a bit of physics, taught it for years, kind of ties all those together. We used to think of matter and energy being separate quantities, and space and time being separate quantities, and the 4 of them being the basic fundamentals of physics. We now know, thanks to modern physics, that matter and energy are just 2 different manifestations of the same thing. And we know that space and time actually are very commingled with one another. Modern theories of physics suggest that you can treat time the same way you do space. And then it's inconceivable that space and time can exist without matter and energy and energy can't exist without space and time. So actually it's a whole ball of wax, we would say, a whole package that comes into existence. So this is the beginning of matter and energy and space, but also the beginning of time. Can you imagine there being no time? Can you imagine there being no space? I can't. We're bound by space and time. I can't imagine no matter and energy either. Well, with God, this is possible because He existed under those conditions. He's outside of space and matter and energy and time. We say He transcends the universe. It requires something, I think, outside the universe to make the universe. And God fits the bill. Nothing else does. This is truly the beginning of everything as we know it. So it does at least denote the beginning of time, but much, much more. And then it mentions God's name, and the Hebrew word used here is Elohim, the very first time. You know, we have such a poor vocabulary for God in English. How many words we have? Basically God, that's it, right? But in Hebrew, there are many different words, very different names for gods, and they try to get this across in the English as best they can. Like, for instance, Lord, L-O-R-D, capitalized, and then there's Lord God. That's a different word being used there, a different phrase each time. So we really miss a lot. In fact, there are entire books written on just the names of God and how they work their way in. So Elohim is this very earliest name for God, a very important name for God, the Creator God. And created, that's another good word. Create, the word used there is bara in Hebrew. And again, whole books have been written just on that one word, believe it or not. Whole dissertations have been written. Turns out, the English word create's not a bad translation of that word. Whenever you see in the creation account the word create, you can be certain that the word bara is being used. And people have debated exactly what that word means. I don't know Hebrew. I've not really studied it formally. I can read and talk to people who have studied Hebrew formally. And they tell me that what's unique about the word bara is that it's a verb in Hebrew that only God is used as the subject. Apparently, biblically, only God can create. Man cannot. Now, sometimes today we see the word create used to talk about things we can make. We kind of think of making something out of nothing to create something. For instance, sometimes you'll see a television show and the credits will say created by so-and-so. What that means is the person who created it came up with the idea for the story, for the TV series, but it's just an idea. He didn't manufacture it, it just popped into his head, or he brought it out of his mind. But that's not what God is doing. God is actually making physical, concrete things literally out of nothing. And that's truly remarkable. So the more I think about that word create, the more, or bara in Hebrew, create in English, the more impressed I am. I think whenever we see that word used, maybe the Lord's trying to tell us something important. We need to look at that and look at the words around it in the context. And that's a tricky thing to do, but it pays to pay attention. And I've been doing this more and more. I think I started really taking those nuances and subtleties very seriously about 10 years ago, more so than I had before. And I'm continuing to learn on these things, and I see in new insights that I never saw before. So the study here is endless, I think. Just think we have eternity to learn more about it. And I think that's the way eternity is going to be. We're going to be learning about God and His creation more and more. There'll never be any end of His learning, will there? Because God is infinite, and we're not infinite. So it will take us eternity to figure these things out. Continuing on, in the beginning God created. Then you have the word heaven, and I'm quoting here from the King James. The King James puts the word heaven as a singular. However, in some translations they put the word heavens, plural. Catch that one. Some translations say heaven, and some say heavens. Can they both be right? Is a good question. Well, it turns out the Hebrew word there is shemayim, and that ending on their im ending is how you make a plural in Hebrew. So shemayim is a plural word. However, it's not a plural like other words because there is no singular form for that. In other words, if you want to say one shemayim, you say shemayim. If you want to say two or more, you say shemayim. Now, that's not quite as strange as you might. Well, for instance, Elohim. Remember the word Elohim I mentioned? Look at the ending on it. Elohim. It's plural, isn't it? That's kind of tricky. It's generally a reference to the majesty of God. God is so big, He requires a plural noun, a plural name. But also people see in this an indication, way back in the very first verse of the Bible, of the Trinity. We have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. And it would be appropriate then to use a plural name for God at that point, would it not? Also, we see when He creates man, He says, let us go down and make God, man in our own image. Let us go down in our image. That's pretty much how it reads in Hebrew, by the way. It is a plural pronoun there. So, shemayim is also a plural form. I actually call this a dual form, is the technical term, because it refers to both of them. And we have some nouns in English that work that way. All right? Have you ever seen an antelope? You have antelopes here, right? Antelope, I should say. And have you seen two antelope? Have you seen three? Have you ever seen antelopes? No, they're just antelope, right? It works very well, doesn't it? Antelope, antelopes. There's another word too I was thinking of. Antelope and
one sheep, two sheep.
Sheep, that's right. I forgot about that. Sheep. You have one sheep, two sheep, three sheep. You don't have sheeps, do you? So we have something like this in English. By the way, back in North America, we have deer, elk, and moose. Same idea. You don't have two deers. You have two deer. You have two elk. You have two moose. So something about grazing animals for some reason, often but not always, we give dual forms to them. How do you know which one you're talking about? If I just use the word sheep or antelope, how would you know if I mean one or more than one? Well, the context can tell you, particularly if it's the subject of a sentence. If I said sheep are grazing in the pasture, you would understand, since I'm using a plural verb, that it's more than one sheep. If I said sheep without the article in front, I know you usually say a sheep or the sheep, but we leave the article off. Just sheep is grazing in the pasture. You would know then, because it's a singular verb, that it's a single sheep, isn't it? So the only way we could know for sure if Shemayim should be translated singular, heaven, or plural, heavens, is if it is the subject of a sentence. And you'd think since this word Shemayim is used 420 times in the Old Testament, that would be pretty easy, wouldn't it? Except 419 times it's used as the object of the sentence, not the subject. Only once does it occur as a subject, and that is in Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. Apparently there they have, there's a plural verb there. Everywhere else, which way do you translate it? Do you translate it heavens or do you translate it heaven? And it's a sense of the translator, what he thinks it ought to be. You know, translation work is not easy, is it, apparently? Some of you know more than one language, and sometimes things just don't translate well, do they? And that's the same way here. You've got to be very careful about how you translate these. So when I see heaven or heavens, I wonder which one is it really? By the way, what are the heavens, or what is heaven? It's referring to stuff above us, lofty things ahead of up above us, our heads, up in the sky. Now that could refer to at least three things. It could be the atmosphere right above us where birds are flying and clouds are. And it also could refer to what I used to call outer space. Now we just call space, where the sun and the moon and the stars are. It can refer to what's beyond where God chooses to reside, because all three are used in that context in Scripture. However, we can maybe use some other words like sky. Where do stars appear in the sky? Does the moon appear in the sky? Does the sun appear? Yeah, they all do, don't they? Do birds appear in the sky? Do clouds appear in the sky? Yeah, so maybe sky is not a bad translation. It could also refer to, again, a mixture of the two. Now, many people have taken the position that this was the creation of space. That is, I won't say the universe, because the universe consists of space and the things inside it, and they didn't come about until day 4. So the position that many creationists have had for some time is that refers to the creation of space, and Matthew alluded to that as well. And up until the last 6 months or so, I would have said the same thing. In fact, I have in print said the same thing. But lately I've been thinking this through and rethinking it, and I'm not so sure it does necessarily. Now again, has the Word of God changed? No, but my understanding has changed. Over the years, I've changed my mind on a lot of things. If anything, I think my positions have gotten a little better. Maybe not in every case, but I try. I work at it, prayerfully approach the thing. So I want to share to you today some things I've been thinking about. But the earth part gets a little easier. The Hebrew word used there is eretz. And eretz can be translated several ways. It can refer to the earth. It can refer to the ground. It can refer to the land. And when I say the ground, when we had the curse in chapter 3, it says, and God cursed the eretz. And it's the same word. It says curse the ground, so it will bring forth thistles and thorns and make it difficult for Adam to till the soil. Also, when it talks about the land that they're going to inherit, going back to the promised land, the word eretz is used there. It's not more than just the dirt now that you're tilling the soil. It's a geographical region. I can look out here, around here, and I can see for miles this land around here, and that is eretz in this sense. If you've got a small plot where you're gardening, that too is eretz. But also, eretz can refer to the totality of all of the land around the world. That is, eretz can refer to the earth itself. So which is it, or is it all of them? Is the big question. Well, we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more here. I want to move on to Genesis 1:2, and what it says there is in the earth. At least, let me step back a second again. So the position of many creationists has been that God created space and He created the earth on day 1. Let me sum up that very quickly, and I'll come back and embellish that a little bit more a little later on. Now, verse 2, it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Okay, the Hebrew word used that's translated without form and void is the words tohu and bohu. They rhyme, don't they? Tohu and bohu. As it turns out, there's a little poetry, a little wordplay, and Hebrew and Greek, both the original languages of the Bible, contains a lot of wordplay. And so when he's describing here that the world was tohu and bohu, it's good literature, it's wordplay, it's mildly humorous perhaps, but it's well-written literature. But it's not just literature, there's some meaning behind that. Unfortunately, without form and void is not the best translation. Some people now want to say unfilled and unformed is a better terms for tohu and bohu. How is it unfilled? Well, are there any creatures there yet? This is day one. There aren't any creatures there yet, are there? There are no plants, there are no animals, there are no people. So it truly is unfilled. They were told to reproduce and fill the earth and multiply. And also it's unformed because you see, the Lord isn't finished yet. If you, I've been struck in recent years, the last 5 or 6, 7 years, about the fact that during the creation week, God just doesn't poof, make things happen instantly, but He uses some processes. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not talking about millions of years. I'm not talking about a long period of time. I'm talking within a day, a normal single day. God forms and shapes things. Like, for instance, how did God make man? He just poof, there's man? What did He make man from? Made him out of dirt, didn't He, right? Dust is a nice term, but I think the word dirt gets to it a little better. And He picks up that dirt and He shapes man out of it. How long did it take? Well, not very long, I'm sure, because God's quite a craftsman. But it did take a moment, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a translation, Danny. In the US, you say dirt. Here, they'll think it's rubbish.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry.
You say mud or clay.
Mud or clay. Okay, I'll clarify that for people who may be watching the recording. I've been informed that in Zambia, saying dirt means rubbish. And I don't mean to say that. Though given our fallen state, that's probably a compliment to call us rubbish. But let me clarify. In the United States, dirt is a perfectly fine word. It refers to soil or dust. All right, is soil a good word for it? All right. It's the stuff you grow things in. So thank you for that clarification. I don't want to be culturally insensitive, and I don't want to be misunderstood. You know? We may speak English, but we're divided by that common language in many respects. Great clarification. Thank you again. So I'll go back to dust, since that's what we generally find in the Bible. But God took dust and He shaped and formed the man, and then He breathed on him and became a living spirit, a living soul at that time, right? So God used a process, a very rapid one, but He used a process. You know, on day 3, when the trees, when the plants appear, it doesn't prove there's a plant. It says, let the earth bring forth these plants. And it says on day 5, let the waters bring forth the animals, the swimming things. On day 6, let the ground, the earth, bring forth the animals. So God used processes, very rapid ones, through all of these things. And so He makes the earth, and then He's forming it and shaping it over the next 5 days to get it what it needs to be. So He's just not finished. It doesn't mean there's a disaster, and you referred to the gap theory that people think it was some sort of cataclysm that caused all this spoilage or something. But really, it was just God was not finished with it yet at this point. So that's what the point is, not finished with what He's doing there. And continuing on, it says water is mentioned there. It's mentioned twice. Water is the last verse in verse 2 is explicitly waters, but it occurs even earlier. The word deep appears there, and that's tehom is the Hebrew word. It's translated into Greek as the deep or the abyss, and that refers to very deep ocean depths. To me, really deep water is a little scary. You know, if I've been in a lake that's very deep, like 300 meters deep, I'm thinking that's awfully deep. What if I drop something, overboard? I'm never going to get it again, am I? Well, let's face it, if it's 5 meters deep and I drop something overboard, I'm not likely to get down and get it either. If it gets much over my head, it doesn't really matter, but still it's kind of a scary proposition. But the deep here refers to water and very deep water. So apparently the earth originally was covered with water. It only makes sense to talk about the deep in that sense. By the way, the word water is mayim, is also mentioned there. And I will give you several times here in Genesis 1, it's mentioned, in, not only in verse 2, but also in verses 6, 7, 9, 10, 20, and 21. Water or some related thing talking about water is mentioned. And what's really neat is that 2 Peter chapter 3 talks about the water as well. I'm looking at my glasses here, and I don't think I did bring them with me. Let me read 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6 for you. If you want to read along with me, go ahead and turn there. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version. 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6. It's talking here about scoffers in the last days coming, mocking and asking, where's this promise is coming? He's not come, it's been years and he's not come back yet. He's probably not coming. He's not going to judge the world. But it says here that these scoffers are ignorant, willfully ignorant. They want to ignore something. It says in verse 5, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water. The earth was formed out of water, it says, and by water. So it says right there in 2 Peter 3:5 that the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. So this is great. This is great what Peter does here. He takes the initial creation in verse 5 and he ties it explicitly to the destruction of that world that in verse 6, the flood, the global flood, and then he goes on in the rest of this chapter, next few verses, to tie it to the coming judgment of the world by fire. Three big events, physical events: the creation, the flood, and the future destruction. The whole world will perish. This world will perish as well, unless we, figuratively speaking, have gotten on that ark of salvation, the door which Jesus Christ is, of course. It's very deep stuff here. In verse 3, it says, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. What is light? Literally, physically. I told you I've studied physics quite a bit, and I'm prepared to tell you that we really don't know what light is. We know a lot about light. It's electromagnetic vibration. But that doesn't really tell you what light is. It's incredible what we do in physics. We know a lot about how this physical world works, but I think at a fundamental level we really kind of miss the whole thing. But God said, let there be light. And apparently prior to this, darkness existed. Now that's kind of a hard concept for some people to grasp, some Christians particularly. I kind of missed this for a long time. We tend to think about light as being good and darkness being bad, but apparently God made darkness first. Wow. And then he made light. It makes a great contrast, and later on, of course, this is amplified. There is a relationship, as I alluded to in my opening comments, between matter and light. So it turns out you can't really have one without the other today. In physics, as we understand physics today, how the world now works, you cannot have matter and light, one existing and not the other. They're like hand and glove. They have to go together. So I can only conclude that apparently on day one, the physical world worked very differently. That is, physics as we know it did not exist back then. Some sort of other physics existed, but not the kind of physics we have now. And this is because this is during the creation. And the creation was miraculous. You know, God works by miracles many times. And I'm what we call a creation scientist. I try to study the way the world now works and try to apply these principles of science to maybe the creation and things related to creation. You know, the problem is there are limits to how far back it will go. Physics is a study of the natural physical world around us. And what's amazing is that there are just a few simple rules, patterns, if you will, that the world follows. And that's the job of the physicist, to try to describe those. And it's amazingly simple. Of course, comprehending all of that's a little difficult, but underlying it, the principles are fairly easy, fairly simple principles, I'll say. Astonishingly simple. And I think this is part of the sustaining by the power of His Word. You know, Colossians 1:17 and Hebrews 1:3, they both talk there of the sustaining of this present world by the power of His Word. You know, this thing we call physics, this regularity and patterns we see in how the world works, I think it's just God's power making things work the way they do. And that's really exciting as a person into physics, because I'm actually describing mathematically the action of God. You know, back, I mentioned before in my earlier talk that science, as we know, is created by godly men, influenced by Christianity and biblical thinking. And they had the attitude, I'm thinking God's thoughts after Him. I'm giving glory to God for what is going on, and I'm merely kind of rediscovering what God has already done in the world. That's great for physics today, but what was going on during the creation week? As a physicist, I can't say. I wasn't there. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just trying to seek clarification on this scripture from reading 2 Peter 3:5-7. That word form. The word form. I wanted to find out if the Greek word that is used there is the same word which is used in Genesis 2.
Okay, which word is that?
Form. Is that the same word?
Which word?
The word form in 2 Peter chapter number 3, verses 5. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed. That word formed. I wanted to find out if it's the same word.
Okay, it's going to be difficult because, you know, the New Testament is written in Greek and the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and those languages are very different. Greek is a little closer to English would be, but I wouldn't begin to know where to start comparing those, to tell you the truth. Yeah?
Pretty open because, in that it is the same from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. They're using the same, but the original in Hebrew is bara. Created is the root for being formed, any other form that you can look at. But in the Septuagint, they will use the same word in the Old Testament as well, as formed. So it's the same Greek that was used in the Old Testament.
That's a great question that I've never thought about. And quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that. So I'll need to look it up, but my gut reaction, again, is the languages are different, Greek and Hebrew, and they might have done a better job translating that Greek terminology in 2 Peter 3 into English. But I'll look into that. I'll see what I can find. It won't be until I get home, I'm afraid. Maybe I can write somebody and let them know what I find. But that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. And continuing on there in verse 4, it says, And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And you may recall from the Genesis account that the word good is used 6 times to describe what He's done. And this is the first time it appears. And this good here refers to completeness. It refers to purpose. As far as God has done at this point, He's finished with the light, and He's calling it good at that point. But it's good. But it's also good for its function and its completeness. There's also probably a moral character associated with it as well. And there's also here the first contrast between light and dark. As God separates, He creates the light, He has the darkness, He separates the two of them. You got light here and you got dark there. And it's the first time there's any kind of contrast made between those. And that contrast is used later, particularly in the New Testament. And it makes a perfectly good picture between good and evil. Between good and evil. For instance, John in chapter 1, verses 4 and 5 speaks about the darkness, men preferring darkness over light. In John 3:19-21, with Nicodemus, Jesus talks about the light and darkness. And in John 8:12, again, the contrast is made. These are just three of the better examples that I could come up with, but it's an excellent picture of good and evil. It's just a picture. It doesn't mean that dark is in itself inherently evil. It simply means it's a good picture of evil. That's why it's not so shocking that God made dark. It's not that darkness is inherently evil. It's just that it's a picture compared to light, because you can see clearly in the light, but you can't see at all in the darkness. And so it's a perfect picture of the difference between good and evil, and what you can see and what you cannot see. And it goes on to say, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and morning were the first day. That concludes the narrative of day one. And this is the first use of the word day, and in Hebrew the word is yom. And again, Matthew was talking about different interpretations people try to put on this because they want to somehow cram billions of years into all of this. And notice that this one verse, to my estimation, is one of the best arguments against the day-age theory, because notice that God defines what he means by the word yom. He says, and God called the light day. Like right outside, it's day, isn't it, out there? It'll be night soon, but it's day right now. That amounts to a definition, isn't it? And immediately, there's no punctuation in ancient Hebrew. Immediately, it's followed by the phrase, and the evening and morning were the first day. And so if you believe the day-age theory, you're going to have to say, okay, that first day, the word yom there, refers to a normal daylight portion of the day, but then in the same idea, the same thought, it's going to mean something else when he says the first day. Well, that's a long period of time. Well, you know, you can use words in the same context in different ways, and it's very confusing, isn't it? Like, for instance, if you need to change the tire on your car, you get a device out of your trunk of your car, and you move the thing to get the car to go up. What's that thing called? It's called a jack. All right? Now, I don't know if you have it here, but there's a little toy. Usually young girls play with it, called a jack. And you have a little ball you drop. You play that game. You scoop these things up as you go. It's called a jack, isn't it? Playing cards. There's an ace, there's a king, there's a queen, and there's a jack. Now, also, if a person is named John, at least where I come from, oftentimes they're just the nickname for them is Jack. I've just given you 4 different meanings for the word jack, haven't I? And suppose I was talking about playing with jacks, little toys game, and then I talked immediately, in the same context, I talked about changing my tire using the jack. You would probably sit there and scratch your head and think, what's he talking about? It's very poor writing, isn't it? Yeah. Who wrote this? Who wrote Genesis 1? We believe Moses did, right? But he wasn't there, so how do you know what to write? Lord God told him, informed him what to write, I think. And is God a poor communicator, a poor writer? No, he's a masterful one. In fact, again, I don't know Hebrew from serious study, academic study, but I read, and it turns out that the creation account is full of all sorts of subtleties in the text. It only comes out in the Hebrew. It's a shame it doesn't show up in the English. And so the point is that if God is such a masterful writer, why did he really blow it if he meant to use the word day in 2 different contexts here? That is extremely poor writing style. And so it's a very powerful argument that day-age theory is dirt. It's rubbish, right? Use that term right this time. And that evening and morning is important. Now, when I was younger, I'd read that. When I was a kid, I'd read that. I thought, evening and morning. That doesn't make any sense. Evening and morning. It should be like morning and evening, right? Because we think of our day beginning at midnight. But to the ancient Hebrews, their day began and ended at sunset. So this day will end in about 2.5 hours or so, 2 hours, when the sun will set. According to Hebrew understanding, it will now be Wednesday once the sun sets. And so evening comes first and then morning follows, and that's the day as you go around. So that too argues, I think, for the day-age theory, because it's giving you the right order, not for a long period of time, but instead for a normal day. And that's the end of day 1, giving us summation. at that point. So what happened on day one? Well, God created heaven and earth, and He created light and separated light from darkness. He called the light day and the dark night, and that is not too bad for a first day of work, right? Okay, verse 6 picks up with the second day. It says that God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." By the way, I wanted to illustrate this, and I thought, how do I illustrate this? So I decided I'd take a picture I took yesterday. I took that picture yesterday at Victoria Falls. Isn't that a lovely sight? That was one of the most remarkable things I ever saw, by the way. I was expecting a lot, and it blew that away. It went far beyond what I expected. I was just awestruck by this. I'll just interrupt myself here. What really impressed me was the fact that, more than anything, was the little tropical rainforest they got there, fed completely by this mist, and I kept thinking that God, caused a mist to go over the earth to water at that point. And for the first time in my life, I think I really got that. I understood that. I'm 60 years old. I finally got this one thing before. I'm learning new stuff all the time. But I know that the earth looked different here at this point, but it does have a lot of water. So it says here, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Now I want to say right off the bat here that firmament is a bad translation. I might put a quote but not the end quote. Sorry about that. Firmament is a bad, because you see the word firmament is suggesting something hard and firm, like a rock or like glass or wood, even wood. As it turns out, the Hebrew word there is rakia. And I can spend a lot of time talking about what the rakia or what that word means, but I'll just cut to the chase. It refers to something that has been spread out. It's been spread out. I understand certain metals can be spread very nicely. We say they're malleable. Gold is really good about this. I think tin to a certain extent. You can take hammers, you can take rollers, and you can beat on it, you can press on it, and you can take a piece of this metal because it's so soft and spread it out. You can make it very thin, you can make it very wide and very long like this. So it's talking, this rakia is talking about something that is spread out. I find that interesting. I don't know what that means exactly. But if you spread something out, you expand it. So many of the newer translations render this expanse. Some even say sky, by the way. So I think that's better because this idea of firmament makes you think of something very hard, something very different from what I think is being talked about there. Now it talks about division of waters. It says there explicitly, let this thing, this rakia, this expanse, divide the waters from the waters. Remember we talked about the earth starts off covered with a lot of water, so it's being spread. It's this thing, this expanse coming in, and it's pushing the water aside. You've got water in one place, water in another place. And it's real easy to think that maybe the water's going this way and the water's going that way. That is, at least horizontally. But hold on. Also notice that the word used there, says God, let there be a firmament, he says, and let it divide the waters from the waters. I'm getting ahead of myself because the next verse says that God made the firmament, and he doesn't use the word bara, he used the word asa, and it's the word made or make. Whenever you see the word made or make used in this part of the Bible, you can be sure that the word asa is used there, and it's a very good translation. And it turns out people can make things. We can't bara things, but we can asa things. Elsewhere, men are the objects, the subject of the verb of the sentence, and the verb is asa. And so it says there in verse 7, and God made, or he asa, made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Now, why did God choose to use the word asa here rather than bara? I don't know. I've given that a lot of thought. If I ever come with an answer, I'll get back to you. Okay? But I just don't know what that means, and I'm prayerfully considering that, studying that, trying to figure out why there's a difference here. I think that whenever there's a difference like that, I think it's significant. But I haven't found out yet what that significance is. But notice what I said before about when I read this verse 6, I'm thinking of separation, horizontally like this. But no, in verse 7 it says, it would separate the waters which were above from the waters which were below. This separation is vertical. It's vertical. Well, that's even more interesting. What does that mean? And by the way, I chose to choose, this is another photograph from yesterday. I'm showing the mist there. This mist is going up, isn't it? So you're getting a separation sort of there, aren't you? You got mist going up and you got water down in that gorge. At least I guess it's down. I couldn't see all the way. So you get the separation. This is small stuff compared to what's going on in day 2, but still I think it illustrates it rather nicely. And it's this rakia, this expanse, this firmament, whatever it is between the two of them. So picture this. You start off with the earth here with water covering it. Then this rakia comes along. It expands outward, and as it does, it takes part of the water with it. So now you have the earth down here with water on it. It's not till day 3 that dry land appears. So the earth with water on it, but not as much as it used to have. And then this rakia, whatever it is, above it, and then above that water. Did y'all get the picture? Okay. Now, verse 8. And it says, and God called the firmament heaven. That is, God called the rakia Shemayim. Those 2 words. And the evening and the morning were the second day. Or the evening and morning were day 2. All right. I'm closing out the second day here. What's interesting is that there's, unlike day 1, there's no pronouncement of good on day 2. God doesn't say, and God saw it was good. Again, I'm not sure what that means. The best guess I have is that God really isn't done with what he's doing here. And remember, it refers, that good probably refers to completion and to purpose being fulfilled. And probably this thing is not really quite complete and filled yet. So he holds back on declaring it to be good yet. It will be, but just not at the end of day 2, because remember, God's using processes. And sometimes you have to be patient from one day to the next, one normal day to the next normal day, to get a complete picture, or even the day after that. But what strikes me here, and this really hit me hard in the last 6 to 12 months probably, is that God himself, it says God called him. This is God now saying this. He makes an equation between the rakia and the shemayim. That is, this firmament, if you will, whatever it is, God calls heaven. That's important, I do believe. Now, many creations, I've already alluded to this, think that this day 2 was the creation of the Earth's atmosphere. And again, I've thought that for a very long time, but now I'm reevaluating that position. I'm going to share with you now in the next few minutes why I'm reevaluating that position. I'm never afraid to say that I'm wrong about something. We shouldn't be afraid to do that. On the other hand, we ought to make sure if we are changing our mind. Number 1, we're doing it for the right reasons, and number 2, we're trying to do it because we want to be more faithful to what the Word's telling us. So again, I want to emphasize the Bible hasn't changed, I'm changing. All right, here's the difficulty that I see. Verse 8 equates the rakia with heaven, that is the expanse with heaven. And Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, right? So if God says that he created heaven in verse 1, which many people presume then refers to day 1, and if God then says in verse 6, 7, and 8 that he creates this thing that he then in verse 8 equates with heaven, it puts us in the curious position that heaven was created twice. Does it not? So when did God create heaven? Day 1 or day 2? Henry Morris, you may know that name. Anybody know the name Henry Morris? All right, so most of you don't seem to know who he is. He was a very influential man. Back in 1961, he co-authored a book called The Genesis Flood, he and John Whitcomb. And that book is a very important book. I read it about a dozen years later when I was in college, very impressed with it. And that book established what we call the modern creation science movement. And he wrote other books, but that's probably his most, he wrote about 60 books actually, that's probably his most influential book. And it really established him as a leader. And Henry Morris staked out this position. He argued that Genesis 1:1 was the creation of space. And he argued that Genesis 1, 6 through 8, that is the day 2 account, was the creation of the Earth's atmosphere. And this has been the position of most creationists ever since. Not most, but most, and it was mine for many, many years. And one of the big things to Henry Morris is he had what he called the canopy model. Remember that water? It's separated. There's water below. That's the water on the surface of the earth. You've got the atmosphere in Henry Morris's approach, and then you got water above the atmosphere. And he believed that before the flood, there was this canopy of water up above the Earth's atmosphere. And at the time of the flood, this collapsed. And this provided the windows of heaven, one of the two sources of rainfall during the flood. And the firmament no longer exists, I should not say firmament, but the waters above no longer exist. Well, there's several problems with that. One problem I can mention is the physical difficulty in making this work. There was an atmospheric scientist who worked, a creationist, who worked a number of years trying to get a model of how this would work, and he could never get to work right. But even more importantly, Psalm 149, I believe, talks about praising the firmament, the waters above the firmament, as if those waters still existed in his day, which is post-flood. And so, if those waters still exist, then the canopy model as a source of the flood doesn't really work biblically, I don't think. So as a result, many of us now have abandoned the canopy theory. That's Henry Morris's idea, but most creation scientists today have abandoned. Remember I talked about changing minds? People change minds. 40 years ago, we all believed in the canopy, it seemed like. In fact, it was about 35, 36 years ago, somebody suggested to me the canopy model might not be right, and I thought, that's not right. You can't do that. And over the years, we realized, okay, the guy had a point. He was way ahead of the curve on this one. I mean, ahead of me. It took me years to catch up with him. But many of us now have abandoned the canopy model. So if we've abandoned the canopy model, isn't it high time that we go back and rethink Genesis 1:1 and 1:6 through 8? I'm not saying we're necessarily going to change our mind. Let's go back and reevaluate it, because Henry Morris was doing this in favor of his canopy model. We don't believe in it and the canopy anymore. Maybe we ought to go back and reevaluate this. Well, what I've run across is that many Bible commentators, many Hebraists, people who professionally study biblical Hebrew, know it very well. They are almost universal, at least the Hebraists are, that Genesis 1:1 is what we call a summary encapsulation. Something like a title on something. It starts off saying, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. It's just basically, this is a summary of this first chapter of Genesis, of how God made everything. By the way, we still use the term heaven and earth as an all-encompassing statement, don't we? You heard someone say, I've searched heaven and earth for something. What they mean is they've looked everywhere. Everything on heaven and earth. That means the totality of existence. The ancient Hebrews did not have a word for universe. And so if you wanted to say universe, you would say heaven and earth. That means everything, the totality of everything. So a more modern, if you will, translation, though not very literal, but a very modern translation would be, in the beginning, God made everything. And by the way, here's how he did it. That's what this statement is. And if that's the case, then possibly the day 2 is the creation of the atmosphere and space together. Remember I said Shemayim refers to stuff above us. It can refer to the atmosphere as we know it today. It can refer to outer space as we know it today. But guess what? Until very recently, nobody made that distinction. I mean, they knew that, birds and clouds were kind of close by, and the stars, the sun, and the moon, they were a lot farther away, but the suggestion that they were fundamentally in two different regimes didn't really occur to them back then. So consequently, I would suggest the possibility, at least, that what was actually made on day 2 was space as we know it and the Earth's atmosphere both. So apparently at the beginning of day 1, God just made the Earth. It's implied there in verse 2, we're talking about the Earth being without form and void. God makes the Earth and nothing else. Now, as an astronomer, and as somebody who's into physics, that's a mind-blowing idea. And I'm not getting that from modern science, I'm getting that from Scripture. And it's causing me to rethink my astronomy and cosmology quite a bit. Yes?
Yes, I thought it's coming up, dwelling on that which came from, I don't know, a student, the one who said Genesis 1 it's used like a subject is covering what God was doing, and then what follows in the next verses. It's like the details of what Genesis 1:1 carries. The word that is appearing there is creation. And in chapter 2, the word that is appearing is dealing with man, it's formation. It says God formed man, but in Genesis 1:26 it says God created man. In him he created them, male and female. So I don't know how, whether creation and formation again, whether they are one or probably they are two different words.
Well, what's going on in chapter 2, it's talking about the details of the creation. He says in the day 6 account, he created man from the dust of the earth, and he told him to be fruitful and multiply, and by the way, you can eat of the plants and so forth. In chapter 2, he comes in with more detail about, okay, he created man from the dust, but he, well, that's in chapter 2. He made male and female at the beginning of chapter 1, but in chapter 2, he made man first, then woman, so there's more detail. If we didn't have but chapter 1, we wouldn't know nearly as much about how he made man. So chapter 2 is an attempt to describe more detail about man's special creation. You could take every bit of chapter 2 and put it in at the end of chapter 1, just describing the creation of man. So it's not contradictory. It's not a different story. It's the fact that it's an embellishment of more detail. That in chapter 1 you're getting the bare details of the story of how God made the world, and in chapter 2 you're getting specific information about man, because man is the most important part of creation.
Actually, I was just looking for a deep understanding in the writer, the way they were interpreting these words. In chapter 1, I'm seeing the word creation is dominating. Even when it comes to man, they are saying God created man.
Yes.
In chapter 2, they abandon the word creation, they come to the word formation. They say God formed man.
Yes.
So even two words, creation and formation.
Right. And the point is that man is made in both created and made. Even in chapter 1 it says that, because man is a unique creation. If you go back to chapter 1, it says in verse 26 of chapter 1, it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every living creeping thing on the earth." So in verse 26 he says he made man. But in verse 27 it says God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. So even in chapter 1, man is described as both created and made. And I think that's almost unique in the sense that we're a special sort of creation at that point. All right, that help? I think some other people will be talking more about the creation of man. So if you have some questions about that, you might want to wait until they speak a little later this week about that. That may help.
Yeah, this theory, I think it's a theory from somewhere. Somebody was saying creation is something that was happening probably, it was like in a realm, like something that made you manifest. It's not something that really manifested physically. But when God was saying, let there be, it was something that was happening, it was a spiritual thing, which needed to manifest in chapter 2, where God is saying, and God formed man out of the dust. That was now things that are manifesting that God was creating. That was the explanation for that theory I got.
No, I don't think it's the proper approach. We'll talk more about it later. All right, so day 2, I'm suggesting the possibility that he created space in the atmosphere at the same, on that day 2. And I'm just really kind of excited the fact that I've been talking to people of late, and I find that there are far more people out there who believe this. They were already there before I got there. This idea that day, Genesis 1:1 is a summary encapsulation of the creation account that refers to a summary of all creation, and then in verse 2 he picks up with more detail about how he did even that part of it. And so it's causing me to rethink things quite a bit. And as I said, as someone who's an astronomer and a physicist, it's challenging some cherished notions on my part, because if this is the way it is, then what I'm stuck with, or what I'm struck with, is the fact you've got the Earth here, you've got its atmosphere, you've got space, and in space you've got planets, the sun, the stars, everything. But then out beyond everything, there must be water out there. There must be water. Now that is a wild suggestion physically. And if I stood up in front of a group of astronomers or physicists and suggested that, most of them would have thought I had lost my mind. All right? But this, I take Scripture very seriously, and I want to know, Lord, does this mean that the universe is surrounded by water? If I'm wrong about this, if I'm misunderstanding what you've written, then please guide me and let me know where I'm wrong on this. And if I'm right, if I'm reading this properly for the first time in my life, then give me boldness and wisdom on how to proceed on this. How I can develop this and share this with people, and boldness to proclaim this to people. It's that big of a deal to me, because as an astronomer, I want to understand the universe as we know it, but I want to do it in a biblical fashion. So I want to close with this very interesting possibility. Have you all heard of what we call the Big Bang Theory? It's this idea that the universe suddenly appeared 13.8 billion years ago. And it was proposed earlier in the 20th century, and it wasn't really accepted until about 50 years ago, when these two scientists discovered what we call the cosmic microwave background. And this is supposedly as a leftover radiation permeating the universe, left over from the Big Bang. And this they've made several big experiments to measure this. They did the Kobe experiment in 1989. They had the next one's a WMAP about a decade later, and then more recently what they call the Planck experiment. And this is a global image. I chose this background slide for my final slide. What they do is they measure the microwave part of the spectrum. It's a very low energy part of the spectrum, and they believe this is coming from the vast edges of the universe. And those little blue and red and yellow, those refer to very slight temperature differences, like 1 part in 10,000. And this stuff's already very cold. It's nearly to absolute zero, which is like minus 270 Celsius. It's that cold. But the universe seems to be filled with this radiation. And the Big Bang Theory, the Big Bang model predicted this. And so when they found this back in the 50 years ago, they hailed this as the proof of the Big Bang. That's why the Big Bang is the only theory out there, really seriously taken by most scientists, about the origin of the universe. And they asked the question, well, you creationists, how do you explain this existence of background radiation? And for years I had the clue. I had the clue about this. But where is this water above? If the water is out there at the edge of the universe, it's got to exist in some form. And since God says that it's Shemayim, or it should be Mayim, which is water, liquid water, they had words for, Hebrews have words for ice, and they have words for vapor or steam. It didn't use either one of those. It used the word Mayim. So if I'm going to take God at his word, then it seems to me, if this is correct, the universe is surrounded by water. Out the far edge of the universe, we're surrounded by like a shell of water. And I do know this physically. If there is a shell of water out there, it will radiate. And depending on how far away it is and a few other conditions, it would radiate pretty much what you're seeing there. So it occurred to me that if some creation scientist, say 60 years ago, would have read Genesis Day 2 account the way I'm suggesting it perhaps ought to be read, a creationist could have predicted this. But I'm standing up here today, I'm telling you for the first time in my life, I have an explanation for this. I can explain the background radiation. Whether this is right or wrong, I don't know, but I can explain it in terms of what God did on Day 2. I'm just sharing this. In fact, I'll give you a little surprise here. This is the first time I've ever shared these thoughts with a public audience. So I'm just getting bold enough to start talking about it. So this is a work in progress. And as a creation scientist, I think we ought to be works in progress. And I'm suggesting this is what this background radiation, microwave background radiation, we're talking about. And I would, if you would like to help me, you know what you can do? You can pray for me. You can pray for me as I try to develop this idea and study it, that God will give me insight to tell me that, no, Danny, you're reading this all wrong. This is what it really means. Or if I'm reading it right, give me encouragement, give me wisdom, give me insight, and again, give me boldness to share with people. I do covet your prayers, and that's a fantastic way to support people like me. And I want to thank you for your attention. I'm delighted to share this with you for the first time publicly, and hope we'll do some more to come. Malcolm, you're coming up.